um, all this nice ragweed season. Two things that I really want to do tonight. One is to talk a little bit about notion of action planning and developing an action plan, which will actually be the next step in the project piece. It'll be kind of a work piece that we need to do to get to the next sort of narrative piece. And then begin to introduce a little bit about research methodologies in a more strict sense, quantitative, qualitative methodologies, and notions of experimental versus non-experimental, and some ideas about causation, and some of those elements that are more directly related to research methodologies. But what I would like to be able to do is to talk just a little bit about your papers. I have not read through all of those yet. I intend to hopefully get that done tomorrow. I had put up the wrong due date and had not scheduled myself to look at things, and having to stay within the framework of sort of time that I have scheduled out to do certain things. And so, tomorrow morning was going to be when I started looking at those papers, and then into Saturday, if I put up if the right due date had shown up on your section. But I'll do your section first. So I'll do those very first thing when I get going in the morning with them. And hopefully we'll have those to you later tomorrow, or at the very latest Saturday.
Dr. Bolt?
Yeah.
I have got a quick question for you.
Sure.
I thought, correct me if I'm wrong, I thought yesterday was our, like, if we changed our topic, that was our revised change. Were you looking for something additional, like a paper-wise?
Well, there were actually two elements to it. One was any revisions you may have made to your research question, research idea, or intervention. And the second element was the beginnings of what you may have found in terms of, beginning to look at the literature around that.
Okay, so if we had just at least started looking through some literature. Okay, so you're not looking for you were not looking for actual paper, correct?
No, not so much, no.
Okay.
Yeah. Now we will begin to fold all of this into the paper outline. I mean, all this is beginning to fold in. The next piece of the puzzle is to do an action plan, develop an action plan, which will be we'll get to that in a minute, but it's a very structured sort of way of looking at the project and how you would go about doing the actual activities related to the project. And once we develop that and get that done, then the next iteration after that will be an iteration that begins to fold all of this stuff into a narrative, a much more sort of polished narrative. And that's the beginning of what will eventually become the final paper sort of draft stuff. And so we're still kind of working at element pieces now, and we're about an iteration away from getting into the actual narrative writing. Other questions? Oh, the next piece, the action plan, will be due by the 24th. So you'll have 2 weeks to do that. We're not scheduled to meet next week, but then when we meet on the 24th, that'll also be the due date for the next iteration, next draft. Questions? Other questions?
I didn't turn mine in yet. It's actually due tomorrow, correct?
Yeah, I'm told tomorrow. Yeah.
Okay.
I just know that some of them had turned them in already, and so I wanted to make sure I got going on those when I start looking at stuff.
I actually turned mine in thinking it was just the question. I did not turn in the part 2. Am I able to unsubmit and then resubmit?
Yeah, you don't even need to do that. You can just submit another version.
Okay.
I mean, the link will take, I think, 2 or 3 submissions.
Okay.
But you did say annotated bibliographies were sufficient for the beginnings of the lit review?
Yeah. It's just where you're at. I mean, that's what I'm interested to know, where you're at with sort of the literature. Other questions?
Was there a specific amount that you're looking for tomorrow? Like, are you looking for
No.
5 to 10? Okay.
Where you're at. You know, it's interesting you ask me that, because there's, I guess it's sort of a contradiction for me, is that right now I'm kind of interested to know where you're at, and yet I'm going to focus a lot of the attention tonight on being specific, which is, I guess, you know, kind of an ironic sort of thing to be doing, given that I just said I just want to know where you're at. You know, the sort of the nature of doing work like this, of doing sort of action research or classroom-based research or impact research or whatever, you know, name you want to put on it. There's lots of different names that people put on it. Is the need to be very specific in terms of what you're doing and what you're expecting to see and things like that. And you know, there's a, if you'll remember, I think a discussion we had at one of the previous sessions, where your notion starts off pretty broad, but then we begin to focus it down and more and more and more get more and more specific. Well, in order to actually do these things, to do things like this, even though this is just a plan, but to actually do things like this, you have to be highly specific. You have to be, everything has to be clearly defined, and what you have to do will, you know, needs to be very focused. And so, you know, it's kind of like, let's find out what we can about stuff, and then, okay, then let's focus down on what we need to do in order, if we were going to actually do this project, what would make it work, what would make it doable, and what would make it, you know, feasible to go about this. I have found that it is useful at this point, as opposed to, you know, once again, thinking in more narrative terms, to begin to think in more, you know, table, chart, more graphic understanding of relationships between things. And for lack of a better term, I'll call that an action plan. And it's a work product. It's not a final product. It'll go into the appendix of the final project. But what it does is it makes you focus on particular activities, particular resources, particular ways of data that will let you sort of know what's going on within a project, and you know, timelines and, you know, things like that, that when you begin to write in sort of a narrative sense, you just start in a narrative sense, you really kind of don't see the connections. You don't see how things line up, and how it's important to kind of make sure that you've covered all the elements, all the pieces that need to be in there. And so what I always have folks do, and what I even do in you know, doctoral classes, when we're getting ready to write research proposals for, you know, dissertation proposals, I do the same thing. I ask people to get into sort of this notion of an action plan, so that we can have a framework around which to hang a narrative. And so, you know, I always found it useful to do it this way, as opposed to just beginning into the narrative pieces. So the next element is an action plan, and we will ask you to, you know, submit that by the 24th. It is not a long project. It's typically a one-pager at most, in a chart or chart format. And so let me give you a table, an example here from your As You Learn page. I'm going to actually do this on the my little overhead thing here as opposed to sharing another screen. And so let me get this up. But this is the action plan that's up on your As You Learn page, as an example. And it's an action plan from an actual project that a school did a number of years ago when I first got here and was working with a group of principals from different elementary schools. And they were looking at different school improvement projects that the principal might implement. And for a kind of a special studies class we were doing. And so I had them develop action plans. And this was a plan at a particular school, I think it was in Ashe County, in which the principal wanted to focus on staff wellness. And so they started with an overall goal, kind of a broad goal, like in if you were looking at a logic model, you might say the 2-year outcome or the 3-year outcome. And the broad goal was to improve staff wellness programs. And the particular device they're wanting to use was a program or a project that was out there at the time called Eat Smart, Move More, Weigh Less initiative. And it was funded by some, there was a funding source in some of the professional education agencies that was beginning to provide some funds, small grants to do this sort of activity. And the one particular principal used this project and this chance to write a project to get funding, and he got it funded. And he got a $2,500 grant to do this particular thing, and then he got some additional contributions from local businesses. And so, he ended up having this thing implemented in the next year, in the next cycle. And this is, kind of the action plan that they ended up implementing. And one of the first things that you always have to do when you're logic modeling or when you're kind of working back from broad goals is to be more specific. And so they created the SMART objective, school SMART objectives. They created the SMART objective of by a particular date. They were very specific about the date, by May 30th, 2010. And they were very particular and specific about the number of participations. They wanted 45 staff to participate in this program, in this initiative. And so that was the starting point for this action plan. Well, the action plan in this particular one, there were 4 elements. There were strategies, 4 columns, evaluation measures, timelines, and resources. And in some plans, you'll find timeline incorporated in with the strategies. They'll simply add a timeline to the strategy statements. And in some action plans, you'll actually find another column. Instead of, if they incorporate timelines in with the strategies, they'll add another column that talks about who's responsible to do certain things. Well, if you're in a small school, it's a small project or small grant or a small library, a small community organization, obviously probably it's the same person that writes the thing is responsible for making sure it all happens. But that's not always the case. I was doing in my last higher ed administrative sort of work a few years ago. Before I came to App, I was running a statewide evaluation grant in Virginia and had a budget of about $2 million a year, and we were doing an evaluation of a federal grant that the state of Virginia had to the tune of about $18 million a year. And so it was, it was a lot of money. It was a significant, chunk of change. And so there's a certain level of accountability that comes with that, and a certain level of staffing that you need to generate the accountability. And so I had about 20 people working on the evaluation component piece, at least at some level, some percentage of effort. And so I needed a column for responsible staff, so I could identify who was responsible to do certain things, and then that way, when I met with different individuals or different teams, we could focus on just those things that they had responsibility for. And so sometimes it's important to put, who's responsible to do certain things. Otherwise, things just kind of, fall through the crack. But the first element and the first piece in developing the action plan, and the thing that comes first typically, is a list of the strategies. And, in this case, I'll slide this up just a little bit. The strategies typically are listed in some order too. And in this case, they're listed in order in which they needed to occur. And so the very first thing needed to be, to promote it. The next thing was to conduct some classes. The next thing was to, give people that completed the classes T-shirts and provide them with pedometers and purchase some weight scales for the school, and work with the county health department to get pre-post blood screenings done for HDL, for cholesterol and LDL and things like that. And so each of these sequence of events literally had to happen before the subsequent one happened, or at least they had to happen before later ones could happen. And so the first thing to do was to figure out, what was that sequence, and obviously the timelines follow that. And then the second thing was to figure out, what was the nature of the resources. And so because it doesn't do any good to, plan activities if you can't also have the availability of resources to do that. And so as they began to think about the activities, they also began to think about, okay, what were the resources? What would they need to do this sort of thing? And then the third thing, as I mentioned, the timeline occurs along with the strategies, and sometimes it's incorporated into those statements. But the third thing then, and certainly not meaning to be the least important thing, was to figure out the evaluation measures that would be needed for each of the strategies. And so you might think across here too. I mean, these things, a strategy is defined by the timeline for that strategy, the resources for that strategy, and the evaluation for that particular strategy. And so that's one reason that we do action plans, because it allows us to, to account for resources and account for outcomes related to resources. There are really kind of two kinds of different data that are being collected here. Now, some of these strategies are things that just need to occur. You need, you have things that you plan to do, and so you just need to make sure that they happen. And so if, for example, if you look at the first one, promote this initiative, well, they did that through email and promotional flyers. And so they basically counted the number of flyers and the number of emails that went out, and sort of where they were located. And so you had the accountability here was more of checkoff or evidence that these things actually occurred. And when they were doing these classes, the 12 classes, they used attendance sign-in sheets as evidence that, who was there. Did they get their 45 staff that they were trying to get to? And so something as simple as sign-in sheets or minutes of meetings, or if there's a strategy that calls for a particular plan, just the existence of a plan, the actual document or the actual web page itself for the plan, that's evidence that those things occurred. And that's one kind of evidence that you always have when you're doing, this sort of activity. Number of pedometers, number of DVDs given out, physical fitness DVDs. And then you have another kind of evidence, which is down here, which are actually measurement-related assessment evidence. And this is actually, number of pounds lost. You want to collect that as evidence, and then you'd want to, analyze that data to see the average and, what happened over time, what happened the first week, second week, third week, and then the decrease in cholesterol numbers. You'd want to track those from before people began the program until through the end of the program, and track the change or the difference between numbers from the beginning to the end. And so that's in a different kind of data, in that it's more a scale data or a measurement data or an assessment type data, whereas the data up here is just evidence that these things occurred. And then there's another kind of data that's not accounted for in here, and that's the data that's related to self-perception, or excuse me, perception by stakeholders. Because you want stakeholders to provide information about their perceptions, and by stakeholders we're talking about staff members and administrators and funding sources, because you want to know what level of buy-in actually existed in this program. What did people think about it? Did it accomplish what they hoped it would accomplish? And it's an important element of the data collection, because you need to know what's the level of buy-in, what are people interested in doing. Is this a sustainable thing? Is this something that's going to continue beyond the scope of the timeline or the funding? And that becomes a question of sustainability. Is there a sustainability element to this thing? Now, if you're going to make improvements in instruction or something like that, in a school setting, or usage of library services or media services, you're going to want to know, do people think this is a worthwhile thing to do? Do people feel that they gain from it? Did they, or is it an activity, or is it a new thing that they're going to, try to continue? What are you going to know about what the level of buy-in is, so you can predict the level of sustainability? When I used to be doing large-scale evaluation work, like the grant I was just telling you about, I would always look for evidence of sustainability, and some of that was perception data. But when you're dealing with large chunks of money and large organizations, you need to have other evidence. And so the evidence that I always look for when doing these big evaluations was three things I would always look for. I would look for changes in budgets, because very often we use special funds or special grants or projects to do new things, with the idea that if it works, we'll incorporate it into our regular budget. Well, if you don't see that incorporation, then when the project runs out, it's going to go away. It won't be sustained. Particularly if it's resource driven, or requires updates, or things like that, it simply won't happen, because you won't have the money to do it if it's not in the budget. It requires generally changes in personnel assignments or personnel responsibilities. And you can't just add, another level of responsibility to someone that's doing lots of other things. You have to have ways of looking at, sort of how do you incorporate it into your ongoing, activities on a, daily basis within an organization. And so you have to have, evidence that there's some change in responsibilities. And the third thing I was always looked for is changes in policy, because maybe it's a school handbook, or maybe it's an institutional, handbook, or some policy statement or strategy statement or strategic plan element or something like that. But if I didn't see evidence of, at least a couple of those, changes in budgets, changes in personnel assignments, or changes in policy, then I knew that, whatever good came out of a particular grant or project or activity is going to go away. It's going to lose, inertia, because there's no sustainability to it. And so you're always interested, and with smaller projects, sustainability lots of times can be evidenced by perceptions, stakeholder perceptions, so you'll know whether things are going to continue or not. And so the one thing that I would probably add into this action plan that's not in there would be an item that deals with collecting evidence of sustainability or perceptions by stakeholders. Now, as it turns out, this was a very sustainable program. They still have elements of this program still ongoing in the school, and it's almost 10 years later. And they have a wellness club, and the staff wellness club, and they get together and have these special dinners where they try different recipes, different organic recipes and things like that. So it's gotten, it did get traction in that building, and they try to incorporate new people coming into the building into the program, just as a matter of, kind of peers talking to peer sort of ideas. So it became a positive thing for that particular institution or that particular school. And so that's the nature of an action plan. Obviously, yours will be focused around the activities you would think would occur, and how the sequence of those activities, and the kind of the nature of the ongoing sort of stuff. There's only a couple of things that I would ask you to think about as you get into that. One is, think about any staff development requirements, because almost always there is a staff development element. In this case, it was covered by the 12 classes, but there's almost always an element of staff development, professional development. And, unlike this one, to include some activities, or an activity related to getting perception data from stakeholders. And otherwise, it will be kind of as you think through, what are the actual activities would occur, and what's the sequence, and, all those things that you kind of have to think about. Now, this is a work product. And so this will become, eventually it'll end up being a display and an appendix to the project, to the overall, to the paper. But it's necessary to do this to define all these elements with more specificity, so that when you begin to do the narrative description of what this project looks like and what's the methodology of this particular activity or intervention or whatever, you will have a pretty solid sort of idea of the logic and how it all fits together. And you'll find that the writing for it will be quite a bit easier to do in terms of narrative. Questions? Thoughts about that?
I think I'm still a little confused as to whether we're doing our own research in the end for this class, or if we're just like reviewing what's out there.
Well, you're developing a plan for your own research, essentially. You're not, you won't end up necessarily doing this. I encourage you to do, to develop something that you might actually do, in a setting or in a particular place. But you're actually developing a plan for how you would go about doing this, and what would be all the elements of things you would do, and what would be the resources you would need, and all those sorts of ideas. Where does some of this stuff come from? It may come from the literature. You know, the literature may inform you as to what other people have done or how other people have gone about doing it. But you know, the basic idea of this is that you will have developed a plan for this particular research or intervention, and how you would go about you know, sort of doing that.
Thank you.
Other comments, questions? All right, let me get rid of the share. You know, this is a kind of it's a very powerful way of going about this, and you know, the way I kind of came into this before you heard about logic modeling and all this sort of stuff is that my first career goal at the university was to be an aerospace engineer. And so I started out as an engineering program in the 60s. And, you know, we were on our way to the moon, and everybody wanted to be an engineer, aerospace engineer, rocket guy, or astronaut, or something like that. And I was no different, except that it never occurred to me that you actually had to have pretty good vision to be an astronaut or a rocket guy. And you know, the engineering part was always very interesting and all, but the more I spent time with engineers, the less likely, the less I could see myself as doing the things that they did, kind of day in and day out. So it was, you know, it was a short-lived career experience, but you know, it was what the first year and a half at university was all about, was the pre-engineering stuff or early engineering stuff. And one of the courses I took, or one of the activities that kind of permeated a number of courses, was this notion of systems models, of looking at things in terms of systems. And later on, you know, this sort of systems model was grabbed up and became in social sciences what they call logic modeling. But when I got to the university level, I actually started writing grants and things like that because I didn't know that you weren't necessarily required to. At the time, I'd get a memo from the dean that said these grants are available. Would be nice somebody to pursue them. Well, I'd write them. I'd write a grant. You know, I'd put them together. And so the first 5, 10, 15 years I was at the university, I had about, I don't know, $20-some million of grants funded, and about 90% of the grants that I applied for, I got. And, you know, from small ones of $5,000, $10,000 to big ones up to a couple $1 million. And the primary device that I used was this sort of logic modeling, you know, action plan sort of device to lay out this grant proposal, and then back it up with, you know, explanatory narrative. And so I could put a lot of information about the project in a very small space by using, you know, sort of this logic modeling action plan type device. And so it was, you know, it became a very productive piece. And as I kind of taught other people to do it, they discovered it was a very productive piece for them too. And one of the guys that I was in my doctoral program with was a guy by the name of John McLaughlin. And John was the person that basically was the first person that developed you know, a series of handouts on logic modeling. And he was also, his background was also pre-engineering. And so he and I were pretty good friends. And he, you know, he ran some of these ideas by me, and he was right on target with all the system stuff and the logic modeling. And, you know, then he was getting ready to publish a book on it. And the Kellogg Foundation, who he had done some work for, published a handbook on logic modeling. And so John was getting ready to sue the Kellogg Foundation for, you know, intellectual property theft. And some of us convinced him that, you know, suing a charitable organization was not necessarily a great career move. That if he ever wanted to do any more work along those lines, he would probably not be you know, it wouldn't be a good move to sue a nonprofit charitable organization. So he didn't, but he got over his anger and bitterness, and about you know, 6 beers one night in a little cantina that we went to, and vented all the things that were bothering him about it, and then he was fine. He was good with it after that. But he, you know, it was one of those deals where it really came out of engineering, this notion of action planning and logic modeling. But it's a very powerful device to use in social sciences when you're trying to lay out projects or the way you want to implement things, or if you want to design new programs. I mean, this is kind of the way to go about doing it, and thinking about it step by step, and alignment across, you know, assessments and timelines and resources, so that you can kind of, you know, get a good sense of how all this stuff fits together. And when you add it to things like flowcharts and stuff like that, it all becomes a very powerful way to think about stuff. Yeah. So action plan, take a pass at it, give it a shot. You know, let's see where it is on the 24th, and we'll give you some feedback on that, and we'll kind of, you know, go from there in terms of what you need to do as you begin to incorporate it into a narrative. Things you need to spell out, things you need to clarify a bit more, or, you know, that sort of stuff. But it will be, you know, more of a technical read as opposed to a sort of a narrative read that I'll use with lit review stuff as we go along. So any more questions and all about action plan, or getting there, or getting it done? Okay, well, let's, as I said, we're going to begin moving into areas dealing with research methodologies. And because this is a research survey of research methods course, and so we'll kind of do a parallel strand here. One strand will be the project you're working on, which is a kind of an application of research methodologies. Once we begin talking about the data you need to collect, you know, how do you measure these things? How do you evaluate the things that you're planning to do? But as a parallel track, we will cover research methodologies, and I'll do it in a fairly summary way. I've got a couple of videos I'm working on to go up in say next week or so that will kind of lay out some of the background. We'll deal with quantitative methodology first, and then we'll get into qualitative methodology after that. We'll have at least a full session on each one of those, and there'll be a couple of videos beforehand to give you some additional kind of introduction into that. I've put up some fairly comprehensive resources on the As You Learn page. The stuff by Cook and Stanley and all that is on quantitative stuff, is kind of the Bible on social science quantitative research. And I put up some different readings, different elements of looking at sort of the background and history of qualitative work. Yeah, we're not going to address those directly in class. I will address those some in the videos I'm putting up, but I want you to have those resources, because those are kind of nice resources to have in hand if and when you become more interested in particular research methodologies, if you're wanting to, you know, go beyond this particular degree or this particular program or whatever. So we'll make sure that all of that stuff is up too. But there's a couple of definitional things that I want to look at this evening. We're not going to stop. We're just going to keep plowing ahead, and maybe in another 20 minutes or half hour or so we'll be done, and you know, put it on one YouTube, one recording. Where's this stuff at? Excuse me for a minute while I go over here and find where this stuff went to on my As You Learn page. Okay. All right. Let me pull this up. There's a couple of definitional things that I think are important to begin with in terms of research methodologies, and that's the nature of what we call causation, and the limitations on the the concept of causation. And the other thing is the difference between what we do in social science research, which is really defined as non-experimental and quasi-experimental, as opposed to what we do, in more basic research, which is considered to be experimental, and what makes social science research kind of non-experimental or quasi-experimental. So we'll real quickly look at a couple of paragraphs on a sheet here, and then kind of call it an evening after we kind of kick those around just very quickly. So there's when we think of research, we tend to think of cause and effect. We tend to think of causation. We think of, we're wanting to demonstrate that if this happens, this is going to happen. And, causation has three primary elements, in that the cause and effect need to be related, need to be significantly related. There needs to be a temporal sequence. In other words, the cause needs to occur before the effect. And there has to be no other logical reason or rationale for the effect. The first one is difficult, looking for a relationship, and that requires us to do generally either a narrative analysis or typically a quantitative analysis to see if two variables are related or connected significantly. The temporal piece is a little bit more clear-cut because we can talk about what happens before something else, but sometimes if things happen relatively at the same time, it's a little bit hard to know really the temporal sequence. And the lack of any other logical, plausible rationale is almost always impossible to discern because we can only see what we're looking at. We can only get information on the variables that we're accounting for. And so we're not looking for other variables, we're not looking for other causes, we're not looking for other things that might be at play. And so what happens, since we're not looking for those other things, we're not aware of them, and so we can't be sure that there's not another logical explanation. So on its face, we can't really get to causation because we're not collecting all the information that we need in order to rule out other causes. Well, the other thing about causation is that, I'll give you an example of where I'm going with this. Let's say I have a headache. I have a terrible headache. I take 2 aspirin, and an hour later, the headache's gone. Now, sort of the logical conundrum we get into is to say, okay, well, the aspirin got rid of the headache. But I can never really know if that's the case because I can't know what would have happened had I not taken the aspirin. In other words, what would have happened in exactly the same circumstances, in exactly the same context, with exactly the same subjects, at exactly the same time, if there had been another treatment as opposed to the aspirin. And so I can never really know whether the aspirin was the reason I didn't have a headache an hour later, or whether it was simply the passage of time. And that's called, in sort of the logic or the philosophical logic, that's called the counterfactual dilemma. And I can't know the counterfactual. I can only know what's actually happened that I've observed or I've accounted for. I can't know what would have happened otherwise. And so because of those two reasons, the counterfactual and the fact that I can never know really what are the other potential logical reasons for a particular effect to occur, I can never really know cause and effect. I can only infer cause and effect. I can only demonstrate a relationship. I can only, I can't really prove cause and effect. Proof does not exist in the social sciences. And it really doesn't exist very well in the hard sciences, because we're always finding something new that explains something we thought we understood. And so, that the notion of causation, we just have to always have in the back of our mind that we can never really causation. We can know with some level of surety, 95%, 99%, 98%, whatever, we can know with some level of surety that we think there's a cause and effect, but we can never, ever really know for sure. And so causation in and of itself is kind of an unknowable. The other thing we're always dealing with is this notion of experimental versus non-experimental, or experimental versus the term that's used a lot is quasi-experimental. And what we can't know is because, once again, there are three basic assumptions, different ones, to what constitutes an experimental model. First, the subjects in an experimental model, particularly a quantitative model, but also in a qualitative model, if it's to be considered experimental, those subjects have to be picked in a purely random manner. Now, give me an example. There's what's called random selection and what's called random assignment. Let's say I took every fifth grade kid in a particular school, so there's 150 of them, and I randomly picked 20 of those to go in a group that I called experimental group, and I randomly picked another 20 to go into a group that I'll call the control group. That's random selection. Let's say I'll go into a school and it's got 5 classes, 5 fifth grade classes. And I randomly pick one of the fifth grade classes for control group and one of the fifth grade classes for experimental group. That's not random selection. That's what's called random assignment, because the kids are in self-contained classes for non-random reasons. Kids are not assigned to classes in a random manner. They're assigned for all kinds of reasons, none of which are random. And so it's important to understand the difference between random selection, which is every individual in a population has an equal chance of being selected into either the control or experimental group, versus random assignment, which means they're self-contained groups. And even though I pick groups randomly, subjects within groups are not random. The second assumption that we make for experimental model is that the dependent variable, or the outcome variable, or the variable of interest, needs to be normally distributed. Now, I'm not talking mathematically, in mathematical sense. I'm talking about a logical sense. And normality is a logical concept. We all know that on most things, we are a lot more alike than we are different. That's normal. There are, I learned a long time ago, about 50 years ago, I guess, in an abnormal psych class, that normal is not a term, it's not a mathematical term, it's a logical term. It's a term that describes what we accept as acceptable behaviors for individuals. And why do we accept that? Because that's the behaviors that most individuals exhibit. But there are a smaller number of individuals, and sometimes individuals, that may act in a way or behave in a way that is far different from that expectation, and we call them abnormal. And when we call somebody for abnormal behavior, it's not because that's necessarily bad behavior. It's because it's different from what we call normal. Normal just means that there's a lot more people behaving that way than there is behaving abnormally. And so normality means that most of the cases fall near the middle. Now, practically, when we do this in a quantitative way, we end up with that standard distribution, that normal distribution, or the quote unquote bell-shaped curve, because that's the way randomly occurring events in our universe or randomly occurring observations are distributed in a normal manner, no matter whether we're collecting quantitative data or narrative data. Most people, kind of tend toward normal. Most events tend toward normal. So normality is, although we can't guarantee it, we can reasonably infer that it might be the case. And third, the experimenter needs to deliver treatments. In other words, you can't work from data that's already existing to be experimental. You have to actively generate a treatment. And so, for example, if you're doing a school-based intervention, you have to do the intervention with groups of kids. Now, the fact that they're not randomly selected means that it can't be experimental anyhow. But at least, if you deliver the intervention, you can meet that assumption of normality. And so the upshot of all this is that most of the work we do in social sciences is non-experimental. We can't meet those experimental conditions 100%. And the random selection is the most difficult one to meet. So therefore, when we do experimental work, quote unquote experimental work, in social sciences, we're more often than not doing what's called non-experimental work. We use the same methodologies, or we use very similar methodologies as if it were experimental. We just have to be careful about providing caveats as to why we can't really accept this as an experimental outcome. And the usefulness in non-experimental social science research is in the replication. Instead of one study telling us an awful lot, 20 studies can begin to tell us a little bit. Because if we replicate studies under different circumstances with different researchers and different subjects, and we begin to get similar results, then we can begin to think about, okay, well, maybe we're on to something here. But one study in a social science setting really is not terribly telling because of the fact that it's non-experimental. And it's not meeting all these assumptions. And plus, causation is a difficult burden to bear anyhow. We just can't really get there. And so, it's typical to think of research as something that's hard and fast and, it really tells you concrete things that you ought to pay attention to, irregardless of what else you see in front of you. And the answer in the social sciences is that, nah, it's not that. It can't be. Because you cannot have, that assumption of causation, nor can you have that assumption of generalizing to a larger population, except with caveats. So good research never talks about proving anything. It never talks about, we've demonstrated for all time that this is the case, that sort of stuff. It provides evidence, and sometimes it may infer causation or predictability, but it's always a matter of a level of confidence with which you are confident in the result. Okay, next time, 2 weeks. We'll begin with, we'll kind of launch into the quantitative methodology first. For 2 reasons. One, that's the primary methodology that's used when you're kind of trying to make decisions about policy of things. You know, if you want to say we're going to teach reading this particular way, you always have to make sure you have quantitative elements in it. Second, because quantitative logic is a little bit easier to understand. And, you know, it's a bit more clear cut, a bit more, you know, there's only a couple, 3 simple elements to quantitative logic. And then all this, you know, vast amount of statistical stuff and all is built around, you know, 2 or 3 common elements and assumptions. And so if you understand those, then you can understand, you know, pretty much any statistic, you know, once you kind of delve into it a little bit. But it's not designed to be a stats course, so we'll stay away from that as much as we can. But there will be some notions like normality and things like that that we'll talk a little bit about. But I'll put up a couple of little videos to provide, you know, some enlightenment as background to quantitative stuff and quantitative logic, and then we'll spend time with quantitative logic in 2 weeks at our next session. And then the session after that, we'll do the equal amount of treatment to qualitative kind of logic. It's a little bit more obscure to talk about qualitative logic, and it's a little bit less clear cut. And so there'll be some elements of that will kind of leave hanging a little bit, and that's just the nature of qualitative work. So are we pretty clear about where we need to be in a couple of weeks? Action plan. Look at the feedback you get on your enhanced question and your start on the lit review stuff, and we'll kind of go from there. And then you can expect probably the first narrative draft of this in about a month or so. You know, after we get a chance to look at the action plan. And so if you want to begin building on that, probably wouldn't be a bad idea to go ahead and get into that a little bit too. Questions, comments? You can always email me. You can always get in touch and we'll answer any questions or walk you through or talk you through whatever. Okay. All right. Ladies, have a nice evening, and you know, get a little rest. I mean, you got to rest up for Friday. You know, you got to put your maximum effort in on Friday just to get to the weekend. So, or at least figure out how you're not going to do as much on Friday as you thought you were going to do to get to the weekend. So, have a nice evening, and give me a yell if you need anything or you have any questions or concerns or whatever, and I'll see you in a couple of weeks. Look for feedback this weekend. Okay, night.